and I am the co-chair of the American Constitution Society of Columbus. And we are very honored to have with us today a guest speaker, Christine Smith, who's a staff attorney and the pro bono director at something called the Giffords Law Center to prevent gun violence. This is an unusual event for us because we're doing this exclusively online, which we are very excited to be trying out, and we appreciate any hiccups that we might have and your patience with any of those hiccups as we try rolling this out. But hopefully we have some viewers online, and we do, and we will have this recorded and available to share with our membership and with the community once this conversation is done. Obviously, the precipitant for this conversation and this opportunity for all of us to learn has been tragedy. And we are eager to learn about the state of affairs in gun control policy and law, among many other issues that Christine and her colleagues at the Giffords Law Center in California are experts in. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christine. And if you have any questions as we go along, please post them to our Facebook page. You can post them to or email them to us directly, and we'll try to get to those as we go along or at the end of the conversation. And Christine has very generously offered to answer any questions that might come up afterward or that she's unable to answer today at a later time along with her colleagues. So with that, I will be quiet and let Christine take over. Thank you so much, Christine, for being with us today from California.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me, and thank you for reaching out to us to talk today about I think something that's on everyone's minds right now, which is gun violence prevention in the United States. So thanks for that introduction, and apologies for the delay. Totally on me and my technical inexpertise. So let me move to something that I actually know what I'm doing and what I'm talking about to some degree. Let me start by talking a little bit about who we are as an organization. Giffords Law Center is in its 25th year of trying to provide expertise on gun laws. We arose out of an assault weapons massacre at a law firm in San Francisco 25 years ago. Our organization has gone through a few names: the Legal Community Against Violence, the Law Center to Prevent Violence, and now, since last year, the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. We are partnered with Gabby Giffords organization in Washington, D.C. They are the lobbying branch of our organization, and we are the lawyer group, for lack of a better way to explain it, sort of the think tank. Our mission is to provide the public from legislators at every level of government, all the way down to grassroots organizations that are concerned and interested in gun violence prevention, with as much resources and information as we can about gun laws. We respond to requests for assistance and information by email, over the phone. We respond to media requests for information, and we maintain a website that we work very hard to keep accurate and up to date, discussing all the myriad policy areas that gun violence touches on. So with that, we can click slides. I want to talk a bit about, I think, what is quite obvious to most of us, and it's that gun violence in America is really, in fact, an epidemic. You don't have to look much further than today's headlines, and this, especially in the past week, to understand this. We can go forward a couple of slides. One more, thank you. So just some, one back, please. Just some statistics here, just to keep in our heads that, every year more than 114,000 Americans are shot. More than 38,000 die by gunfire. So if you just think about that for a second, it's 104 every day. That's about 4 an hour. It's a terrible death toll that the country is facing in human life as well as cost. Gun violence costs the United States $229 billion a year. That's about $700. And I thought you might be interested in the Ohio number. We recently published a report on the cost of gun violence in Ohio. That number is $2.7 billion a year, and that does not include any sort of pain and suffering damages that a jury might award, for example. And that, so those are astronomical numbers. You can go ahead and move slides, please. I am always flabbergasted by this particular statistic. Since 1968, more Americans have died from gun violence in the US than on battlefields of all the wars in American history. It's just something to keep in our minds as we come to understand how this issue is something that desperately needs to be addressed at every level of government. To give you an idea of why we have this epidemic and why we seem to be having a problem approaching it or solving it, one of the issues is that the Centers for Disease Control are not able to treat gun violence as they would any other kind of epidemic. And just to give you some idea, between 1973 and 2012, there were 2,068 deaths from cholera, diphtheria, polio, and rabies. And during that time, there were almost 500 research grants to study these diseases. Now, if you look at those numbers as they relate to the epidemic of firearms, in the 1973 to 2012 year span, there were 1,500,000 deaths from firearms with 3 research grants that the CDC was able to give. A lot of this has to do with the 1996 appropriations rider in Congress that basically precluded the CDC from using any funds for research that would advocate or promote gun control. Now, people might wonder, you know, and I was, I lived in Singapore for several years, and I taught at the law school there, and my students would ask me, Christine, what is going on in the United States with guns? And I really didn't have a lot of answers for them. And I think it's a multifaceted question that doesn't actually have an easy answer. And it's what our studies have shown is that it is a uniquely American problem. We have a very, very high rate of gun murders as compared to other countries that are equivalent to us in economic baseline. But interestingly, we have a lower rate of crime. So we are not violent as a country, but we seem to be more violent when it comes to guns. So the question is, what is being done and what can be done? I want to take you through some of the efforts that are either being made or not being made, as the case may be, at the federal, state, and local levels. The Giffords Law Center works with legislators at all of these levels to try to advance gun laws that we believe would reduce incidents of gun violence. So let me start at the federal level and tell you a little bit about what federal law does. So at the moment, federal law requires that licensed gun dealers, those who have applied for a license through the federal government to sell guns because they're in the business of selling guns, that they conduct a background check on purchasers of guns to ensure that people who the federal government has determined should not have guns, felons, for example, individuals who have been committed to mental institutions in the past, certain domestic violence criminals, that these individuals don't end up getting guns. So at the moment, federal law does require federally licensed gun dealers to run those background checks before a gun sale can go through. Federal law also, as I just alluded to, prohibits certain individuals from possessing guns. And again, felons, people who've been committed to a mental institution are 2 of those examples. Federal law also requires gun dealers to provide locking devices to handgun purchasers so that a gun can be locked up in the home. Federal law regulates certain military-style weapons that have been proven to be the most dangerous. Machine guns are examples, silencers, other kinds of weapons. Unfortunately, federal law also cloaks the gun industry with broad immunity from civil lawsuit in a statute that was enacted in 2005 called PLACA. So that's an unfortunate part of federal law that can be quite challenging. Now let's talk about what federal law does not do. Federal law does not require an individual who is selling a gun and is not a licensed dealer to run a background check. This is troubling because a large number of guns that are used in the commission of crimes are purchased through private sales, 87%, in fact. So one of our top tier priorities, when I say we, I mean Giffords Law Center, is to increase the number of states that have, since the federal government does not require background checks for all kinds of sales, one of our top tier state legislative priorities is what we call universal background checks, to require any sale of a gun to only go through after a background check has been completed. Federal law also does not regulate other weapons that we would consider quite dangerous. 50 caliber sniper rifles, for example, large capacity ammunition magazines. Those are those ammunition magazines that can hold 10 or more rounds of bullets, and they're quite lethal. And assault weapons. And the recent mass shootings, Sutherland Springs, Parkland, Las Vegas, were all committed with assault weapons. Federal law also does not limit the number of firearms that can be purchased at one time. So we are seeing over and over again individuals who have arsenals of weapons at their disposal. It also does not impose a waiting period before purchase of a firearm can go through. A waiting period or a cooling off period has proven to be very effective in reducing incidents of suicide, where somebody may purchase a gun in the heat of a moment in crisis. Congress has a few bills in front of it that I want to just present to you to let you know what is going on at the moment at the federal level. One of them is quite dangerous, and the rest of them show promise. The Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act is a bill that passed the House last year and has been moved over to the Senate. In a nutshell, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Bill says that if you have a permit to carry a concealed weapon in your state and you visit another state, the state you're visiting has to recognize your concealed carry permit. Michael, can you go to the next slide? And then I'm going to go back. So this is a map of what the different laws of concealed carry are in the United States. So, for example, if I live in Texas, which is a state where it's quite easy to get a concealed carry license. And when we talk about concealed carry, it's it's having a license to carry, for example, a handgun in a holster under your jacket, or to put a pistol in your purse. In a state like Texas, for example, or New Mexico, it's quite simple to actually get one of these permits, unlike in California, for example, or New York, where the standard is a little bit higher. So somebody in Texas can now get a permit, travel to San Francisco or New York City, and walk the streets of those cities carrying a concealed weapon without regard to the standard that would have been required had they actually had to apply for a permit in one of these other states. So what is happening with this law, should it pass, is that it reduces the standard to the very lowest it could possibly be when it comes to issuing a permit to carry a concealed weapon. Okay, you can push back up to that other, yeah, perfect, thank you. The other bills that I have listed there have been filed, and they are in various stages of progress. The Fix NICS bill was put forth before the Parkland shooting, and what this bill would do, and it was really in response to the Sutherland Springs shooting, was to provide more funding for states to report more information to the background check system so that it actually really, really works the way it should. So that is actually very good news to have that bill pending. The rest of these bills were filed, what I believe and what we think was in response to the Parkland shooting. The background checks bill would close some of what we call the private sale loopholes in the background check system, meaning that any sale, for example, that takes place at a gun show or over the internet, the purchaser would have to undergo a background check before being able to purchase that weapon. There's also an assault weapons regulation bill pending that would in some ways regulate assault weapons. There is an extreme risk protection orders bill pending. An extreme risk protection order is a very, very useful tool for individuals who know somebody who they believe is at risk of harming themselves or others. These are also called gun violence restraining orders, and it allows a family member or a member of law enforcement to approach a court and get a protection order so that this particular individual cannot purchase or possess a weapon. Various states have enacted these. California has one, for example, that came after a shooting out here in, near Santa Barbara. And it's a really, really good tool to keep guns out of the hands of people who are showing signs of violence, especially with guns. There's also a bill pending to raise the age to purchase an assault rifle. There is a bill pending to affirmatively allow the Centers for Disease Control to research gun violence. There has been talk of a bump stock ban. There is a federal bill pending. I don't think it's moved anywhere. We haven't seemed to get any kind of bipartisan ability to move these bump stock bans forward. And for those of you who may not be familiar with these, the bump stocks are the device that was used by the Las Vegas shooter to render his assault weapons machine, basically turning them into machine guns because of the rapid rate of fire that a bump stock makes a rifle shoot at. There has been quite a bit of movement in the states on banning bump stocks at the state level. And the last one is the terror gap. This has been around. This has been back and forth for a while. It's a bill that would basically prohibit anybody on the terror watch list from being able to purchase a weapon. Okay, so that's the federal legislative landscape at the moment. We are obviously watching it very closely. Giffords Law Center has a federal policy director in Washington, D.C., and we answer as many questions as we can and assist in any way we can with this federal legislation. I guess the good news about the federal legislation is we've seen a lot of movement since Parkland, and this has been on the front pages. What doesn't necessarily always get on the front pages is the state legislation. Just to give you some idea of what happens at the state level, and just so you know, Giffords Law Center tracks every state bill and then any state law that gets enacted, so we can have a sense of what's going on across the state landscape in state legislative efforts to reduce gun violence. We track all state legislative activity. Since the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012, 45 states have passed in total 210 new laws that aim to reduce incidents of gun violence. So that's good news, and that's something that's very exciting to see, to know that states are taking these affirmative steps to reduce gun violence. We track these bills. You can go ahead and, yeah, great. And we do this. We prioritize we have certain laws that we think are the most effective, and we actually track and grade each state based on the efforts that their legislators are making to get smart gun laws enacted. And our website has this great resource called the Gun Laws Scorecard. So people can look at their states and get an understanding of, well, you know, what is the status of the laws in my particular state, and how are they affecting, how is that affecting rates of gun violence? And the reason that we do this is because the studies are showing, you can switch slides there, thanks, is that when a state has stronger and meatier and tougher gun laws that have teeth, the states are showing lower gun death rates. So the chart that's up right now shows what the studies are showing, and this is why we do this work of tracking, is that states that are getting A's, states that have good gun laws and strong gun laws, are really showing lower incidents of gun death rates. And when I say stronger and meatier gun laws, every particular policy area has kinds of laws, and some states have very strong gun laws, and some states have a similar policy area covered by a gun law, but the law may actually not be, may not have as much teeth. So they certainly vary in how they are enacted, the different provisions they are enacted with, and the different kinds of laws that we're looking at, and I've listed them. These are our targeted policy areas. Are background checks. Again, laws that are going to require all gun sales to go through a background check before a purchaser can get that gun. We are looking at child access prevention laws. These are laws that do well to keep guns, do well to keep kids from accidentally getting hold of guns. We are looking at laws that make it harder for people to get a concealed carry permit, laws that require more domestic violence abusers to be prohibited from buying a gun or having a gun. We look at and try to promote and advocate for these extreme risk protection orders, so that if you have a loved one who might be at risk of harming themselves or somebody else, you can go to a court and apply for a protection order that would preclude that individual from getting a gun. And of course, military-style weaponry, whether it's machine guns or bump stocks or assault weapons. We are proponents of laws and look for states to enact laws that would reduce a person's ability to get access to these guns. So what have the trends been? We can go down a slide. Wonderful. So this is what we've seen over the past year. This is what's trending in state legislatures across the country. We're seeing movement in expanding background check laws. We're seeing movement in expanding and increasing the scope of domestic violence laws. We're seeing more interest and more bills in extreme risk protection order, which is great. And more than half the states in this particular legislative season have filed bills to ban trigger activators, also called bump stocks. So that's also really great news. Okay, go ahead and switch. Now, of course, while we are hard at work advocating for the laws that we believe make sense from a gun violence perspective, the gun lobby is doing the same thing, and we also track what's trending in laws that are more in keeping with a gun rights perspective. So the laws in the states and the bills that we're seeing and the laws that are getting enacted are allowing guns in K through 12 schools, allowing guns on college campuses. Georgia, Texas, and Kansas are three examples of those. Laws that allow individuals to carry a gun, whether it's concealed or whether it's open carry, without having to obtain a permit. This is also called constitutional carry. And also, we are seeing a surge in bills and laws that expressly preempt local jurisdictions from enacting firearms ordinances. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but almost all but a handful of states in the United States have express firearms preemption laws. But what we're seeing a trend now are what we call extreme preemption or super preemption laws, where a local council member, for example, should they enact an ordinance that turns out to be preempted by their firearms preemption law, the local council member is subjecting themselves to either civil or criminal, as is the case in Kentucky, sanctions. Okay, speaking of preemption, our organization does work in a handful of states at the local level on several fronts. You can go ahead and click that slide. As I said before, there are a handful of states where there's either no express firearms preemption law, or there is a law, but it's not as broad of a preemption law. So in California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Nebraska, New Jersey, and New York, local legislators, council members have some room to enact firearms legislation or firearms ordinances, which we find to be very important, because sometimes community leaders are in the best position to understand exactly what the issues are in their particular jurisdiction. What are they, whether they're having issues with gun crimes, or they just feel as though too many people are walking around carrying guns, and they are in the best position to enact the laws that they think would be the most useful for their communities. So In the rest of the states, there is very little room for any local jurisdiction to enact firearms ordinances, and it's been quite a struggle to try to help some of the local council members who live in, I'll use Kentucky as an example again, where it's very difficult at the state level to have any firearms laws passed, and at the same time, council members, for example, in Lexington or Louisville, where there is a lot of gun violence, can't do anything from an ordinance perspective, from a regulation perspective, because of the very, very strict preemption law at the state level. I thought you might be interested in the status in, and this may be something that everybody who's listening to me already knows, but I felt that since we're in Ohio, I just talk a little bit about the local authority to regulate firearms in Ohio. So forgive me if you all know this already, but in Ohio, municipalities have a broad constitutional grant of home rule. Unfortunately, when it comes to firearms, the Ohio legislature enacted a law that really, really ties the hands of local legislators. The law was litigated out of a gun violence prevention set of ordinances in Cleveland. And last year, the appellate court basically struck down every ordinance as preempted, except for two of Cleveland's ordinances. It left two standing, but it struck down, I want to say, about 9 of the other ones and invalidated them as preempted by Ohio's express firearms preemption law. I believe it was just at the end of January that the city appealed and the Supreme Court refused. Yeah, January 31st. It's there on my slide. They refused to hear the appeal. So considering that law, that case, it would be very, very challenging for any city to withstand a preemption challenge to a great number of firearms ordinances. All right, I want to leave the legislative area for a minute and talk about, another area where gun violence prevention, where we can advocate for gun violence prevention, and that's in the courts. Giffords Law Center has a litigation element to our work. We track Second Amendment cases across the nation, and where appropriate, we file amicus briefs to be sure that the court has the information that it needs in front of it to render a decision with the most information as possible. So that's one way that we're involved in the courts and advocating for gun violence prevention. The other way is that we pair local jurisdictions that have gotten sued by the gun lobby for local ordinances that are being challenged on either Second Amendment grounds or preemption grounds or any other grounds that have to do with firearms. And we have paired up those jurisdictions with pro bono law firms who represent the jurisdictions free of cost. So we've had great success in that area. And we have also just started about last year some impact litigation, trying to really push, trying to understand better how we can challenge some of the laws that are on the books that we find are deterrents to the prevention of gun violence. We joined forces with Brady and the Brennan Center for Justice from NYU Law School, and we created a coalition with a group of large law firms on both the East and West Coast to start challenging some of these laws. I think the most recent effort that we were involved in, a law firm in New York, with our guidance and consultation, filed a lawsuit against the Department of Defense after the Sutherland Springs shooting for a court to issue a mandamus for the Department of Defense to do a better job in reporting its military convictions to the NICS system, the federal background check system, so that people like the shooter in Sutherland Springs cannot and should not be getting access to firearms. So as I said, a lot of our work has to do with the Second Amendment. I like to read the Second Amendment every once in a while and remember what it says. You can go ahead and flip the slide because I know we all know what it says. And when I think about the Second Amendment, this is also something I kind of try to keep in the back of my head, is how the arena of guns has changed so dramatically since it was written. We can go ahead and flip. The most famous, for lack of a better word, or prominent case, this happened in 2008, and again, I would imagine that a lot of you have heard of this. In the District of Columbia versus Heller, it was the first time that the Supreme Court recognized an individual right to possess a firearm. It's really important, I think, for everyone to remember what Heller actually said. It is not a broad recognition of a right to have a gun wherever anybody wants. It's an individual right of a law-abiding, responsible person. In other words, not felons, not individuals who may or who shouldn't have a gun because of a mental incapacity, to own and use a handgun for self-defense in the home. That is the very, very limited ruling and the very small circle of that right under Heller. Let's switch sides. And I guess equally important to remember, as I alluded to just now, is what Heller did not say. And it's not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever purpose. It does not prevent regulation or preclude regulation of concealed carry, for example, or prohibiting guns to be possessed by certain individuals who shouldn't have them, nor does it prevent states to regulate where guns should be in sensitive places like schools. And it also does not allow putting conditions on the commercial sale of firearms, for example, requiring gun dealers to have security measures in place so that the guns don't get stolen and then trafficked. Since Heller, switch slides, please. We can go ahead and switch that slide. Thank you. Since 2008, since that Heller decision, there have been more than 1,000 Second Amendment challenges to gun laws and other firearms ordinance across the country, and nearly all of them have been rejected in the lower courts. Laws that define who a prohibited person is, laws that limit where concealed carrying licenses, laws that place restrictions on where you can carry a weapon, and laws that place restrictions on assault weapons and large capacity ammunition magazines have all been upheld despite Second Amendment challenges. And I think what's also very interesting is to see sort of the landscape of what's coming in Second Amendment litigation. The way we see it and the way our work is showing us is that there are 3 areas where we anticipate seeing some movement in the federal courts as it relates to Second Amendment issues. The first is public carry and how the Second Amendment, whether the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to public carry, whether openly or concealed. This will center around the Heller language that talks about the right to own and possess a gun for self-defense in the home, and whether that language will be expanded at all to allowing that amendment to be read to include public carry. There is also the issue of large capacity magazines and assault weapons, of whether these are arms within the protection of the Second Amendment. There is actually a circuit split. At the moment, there's a case pending in the Ninth Circuit where a challenge to California's large capacity ammunitions magazine ban was upheld in the Southern District of California, and that has been appealed to the Ninth Circuit. And there is a Fourth Circuit decision, the case is called Colby, if anyone is interested, that that essentially says that states can regulate large capacity magazines and assault weapons. And the other area of Second Amendment jurisprudence that's vast, and we see a lot of activity here, are what we call as applied challenges. And these are what we're seeing these in the jurisprudence surrounding prohibited persons, individuals who who Congress has determined should not have a gun. And I'll just give you an example. There was one case where there was an individual who had a minor misdemeanor, or who was committed involuntarily to a mental institution a long, long time ago, and based on that has been prohibited from purchasing a gun. And he rendered a challenge to the prohibited persons federal law that it violated, not that the entire law violated the Second Amendment, but as applied to him, it violated the Second Amendment because of the nature of his facts, because of his particular circumstances. These cases are troubling to us because they are all over the place. They're very, very fact specific. So they will tend, and like any sort of very fact specific cases, they will tend to create jurisprudence that is very difficult to apply across a large geographical area. So these are some of the issues that we are anticipating seeing some movement in the Second Amendment front. Okay, now. I think I've covered sort of from the top down attempts that we make to stem gun violence and what we try to do to help prevent incidents of gun violence. About 2 years ago, Giffords Law Center realized that a lot of communities were just way ahead of us in understanding that sometimes addressing a problem from the top down is not as effective as addressing it from the bottom up. And we started talking about this particular fact, that men of color make up 6% of the population in the United States, but account for more than 50% of all gun homicides that tend to be very concentrated in urban centers. And as a result of that, we started doing research and initiated our Urban Gun Violence Initiative. Now, when we talk about urban gun violence, what this really is are violence prevention programs. And in our particular case, we are interested in violence prevention, but mostly gun violence prevention. And we are advocating for non-legislative solutions to the problem within communities. We are finding that when you pair gun safety laws, strong gun safety laws, with these community-based intervention programs, that the rates of gun violence in these particular communities we're seeing really, really good reductions in violence. There are a couple of models of urban gun violence or violence intervention programs. There are what we call group violence intervention programs, where a community will employ different methods of trying to help solve the needs of individuals who may be prone to gun violence. For example, helping them understand helping them understand how to better educate themselves, or helping to get out of the gang lifestyle, or helping solve their legal needs, maybe help with employment, or maybe they need something cleared from their record to lift them up in society and to try to help them on an upward trajectory away from the violence. So these group violence intervention programs have shown a really, really great success. The second kind of violence intervention program that we've been involved in and helping advocate for are what are called hospital-based violence intervention programs. And these are premised on the principle that an individual who's been shot and is in the hospital, that person it's a teachable moment. It's kind of like someone who has a heart attack, right? You're in the hospital and you've had a heart attack, and you don't want to have another heart attack. So the hospital will come in with a nutritionist, and maybe a physical therapist, or maybe a counselor to sort of nip it in the bud. And when you leave the hospital, to follow through with a nutritionist and an exercise program, to use your heart attack as a teachable moment to reduce the risk that you are going to suffer another heart attack. Similarly, with a gunshot, if there's an individual who's in the hospital, there are social service organizations that are now connecting with hospitals to talk to gun violence victims and connect them with services they need and to try to, for lack of a simpler way to put it, help ensure that they don't get shot again or shoot anybody else. So, for example, once they're out of the hospital, how can we deal with any criminal matters that may be pending? How can we help them with any immigration or family law issues that may be pending? How can we make sure they get their GED? These kinds of steps have been very, very successful. And we have one staff attorney here who this is all he does, and we advocate and help as much as possible with getting these organizations more money, making the public more aware of this really great grassroots efforts to reduce incidents of gun violence. I thought you might be interested in what's going on in Ohio in the area of these violence intervention initiatives. There were just two that we really wanted to bring to your attention. One is a group violence intervention program that is in the city of Cincinnati, which, according to my quick research of it before, while preparing for this presentation, looks like a very promising project. And there is also at the state level a hospital-based violence intervention program that has taken off in Ohio, and it's 5 hospitals. I've listed them there on my PowerPoint, and each one of these hospitals is being paired with a social services provider in the community to make these connections to try to help victims of gun violence, or actually victims of violence in general, including gun violence victims, get the help that they need to get their trajectory away from violence. That really concludes the remarks that I really wanted to say. I hope I've been able to give you an overview of the efforts that our organization makes, and the landscape of some of the efforts that are being made across the country, both at the state level, local, federal, in the courts, and on the grounds.
Well, Christine, that was just a tremendous presentation. Thank you so much. I'm sure that we all learned a great deal. The hospital-based efforts are fascinating. In particular, I have to confess, I live in Columbus, and I did not know that existed, let alone that the Wexner Center at Ohio State was involved in that. So I have some research to do on that and other issues. We did get a few questions. It's already 6:16. I want to be respectful of time, so I want to at least ask this one of you. And I'm sure we'll have follow-ups for you at a later time. But this one is obviously Justice Scalia was a very strong defender of a particular interpretation of the Second Amendment that helped result in DC versus Heller. What do we know now about any group of 5 justices on the court? And do we have any sense of how some of those pending federal cases might be decided based upon some of the new makeup that's on the court?
You know, it's really interesting. I had a slide in my presentation that addressed this, and now I know to leave it in. Unfortunately, there was the Supreme Court denied cert in a case recently that would have been a bad cert petition for gun violence prevention. But Gorsuch, the newly appointed justice, along with Thomas, rendered dissent in that case, basically espousing the fact that he's troubled by how the Second Amendment has become the taboo amendment, and how the court shouldn't be ignoring it and shouldn't be afraid to rule on it. So that's to give you an indication that we certainly know where Gorsuch stands on the Second Amendment. I mean, I think he would be, it seems to me anyway, and it seems to us, that he would be prone to expanding that right. I don't know. I mean, I know how some judges would probably rule, depending on the case in front of them. I can tell you this, that there was a recent case in DC that basically said the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to publicly carry a weapon. And the DC Attorney General's office refused to appeal the decision to the Supreme Court for fear of making bad law. They were responsible for Heller, and I don't think they want to be responsible for, a open carry across the nation. So without actually saying how I think any of the justices would rule. I'm certainly hoping that Ruth Bader Ginsburg hangs in there, but I do think there's some concern from the Second Amendment perspective of should a Second Amendment case go up to the Supreme Court, how that would affect the scope of the Second Amendment.
Well, Christine, thank you so much for all of your time and all the work you put into this. Again, on behalf of the entire ACS Columbus chapter and to all of you at the Giffords Law Center, thank you so much for your work and your studious understanding of all of these issues, and certainly your presentation today. It was very educational. I'm sure we'll all be in touch again soon.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure to speak to all of you.